Ülle and Alice, you've been listening to these presentations. You have been thinking along, looking into these experiences that were described. So what thoughts did this come up with you before we will continue with the two first presenters? Microphone. The speaker has to use the microphone. Thank you to both presenters, because these subjects that we've been talking about today are part of the daily life of our universities, and maybe not the most pleasant part of our lives, because it causes a lot of bureaucracy in the universities, also misunderstandings very often. And when we are speaking about efficiency of science and the contribution of science to the society, but the more we have red tape, the less the scientists have time to really engage in their work, in the work proper for which they are in the university. Now, if we look at the background, what we have here in Estonia, based on our universities examples, and I can give you some numbers. We have a small university, we have 450 academic staff and a little bit less than 3,000 students, and we are focusing on agriculture, environmental matters related to this, forestry, veterinary science, plus some technology and economics as well. When we are looking at our budget, annual budget, then 42% of our revenue comes from research and development activity. And when we look at our R&D revenues in more detail, then 17% is base financing. This is the money that we can be sure of, that we are going to get it pretty much in the same amount every year. And in 2018, 83% of our R&D money was project-based. When looking at the project-based monies, then 18% came from the EU and other foreign projects, and 46% from EU structural funds. In total, we had 249 projects, and there were 41 different financing programs or financing schemes. So the total number of projects, the number of different funders, means that the project managers and scientists and the whole support system of the university has to deal with this variety of funding sources, the different rules that apply to eligibility of costs and reporting. And this is a huge administrative burden for universities. So in this context, these subjects that you were touching upon today are vitally important for us, because to find reasonable solutions of how to reduce such administrative burden, and at the same time how to make sure that all projects are implemented in a transparent manner, that the university is trustworthy. This is all a very important issue for us. Speaking about Estonia, then really Our position is that on the one hand we have research funding, it's quite scarce, we are not able to fund all our researchers. On the other hand, we depend a lot on project-based funding and EU structural funds, and that makes scientists worry, especially during the time when the structural funds financing periods are being renewed. But I would like to now touch briefly upon your presentations as well, and I will have some questions concerning your presentations. First of all, Toomas spoke about the principles of efficient control and that we should move towards ex-ante systems and we should audit processes instead of specific costs. Could you enlarge upon this a little bit more? Could you give us some good examples? In addition to Ireland, other countries may have also applied this system.
Yes, thank you very much. I think the part on why we promote moving towards system and process audits is because it's a more modern form of control, or actually it's already moving towards improvement. You do have, as I mentioned, several systems where national research funders use that. It requires, and maybe that is one of the preconditions, it requires already having at institutional level appropriate mechanisms in place. So this is not something where you can skip, let's say, a part. What it requires is also the part that I showed at the beginning. You need to have appropriate costing systems. Ideally, if you have a methodology that is sort of established, that makes it more efficient, because that means that the National Research Fund that doesn't need to do a system and process audit in each institution, but you can work it out at the national level. So that would be, let's say, the most efficient way of doing it, particularly in a small system like Estonia. Something like this would make sense. But we have in Europe other systems, and where they work it out between institutions. What it requires is an effort at the beginning. So you have both on the funder side as well as at the institution side, you need to spend more time on understanding the systems, what is in place. But then there is the advantage that once you have accepted that you have processes in place, you don't do an audit later on the individual expenditure, but you come in sort of in a different timeline and say, okay, where have we improved? Or you only check on those procedures where the system and process audit identified, let's say, a weakness in the system. So it's really moving and saying, do you have internal control process in place? Do you have internal quality assurances in place? What's the procedure in terms of collecting data? How can you, so that you have an assurance that these processes, these checks and controls within the institutions are in place, so you don't have anyone from the funder coming in checking individually, but what you check is these control mechanisms, and that's in the end, in the long run, a much more efficient way. It is clear, and I think that is very clear in the experience of those who have done it, that it takes more effort at the beginning. So that's also the feedback we had, for example, from the Austrian funding agency FFG, when they worked it out with an institutions. Both of them said, we needed both sides, we needed to invest quite some time, but after 2 to 3 years, they said it had a massive simplification effect on both sides. So it's actually a win-win situation to move to that.
Can I interject with a quick question? We heard from Joan that Science Foundation Ireland has successfully agreed to these things on the national level, but has not moved to agreeing those things with the European level. And Ulla just said that European funding plays a very big role in for example, her university's budget. Do you know of any example from anywhere in Europe where the national level and the EU level have successfully somehow cooperated on combining either the auditing mechanisms or any of the systems really? Because I think in many countries what would tend to be the local funders' response is that the EU rules are quite inflexible in terms of agreeing this.
Unfortunately, the answer is no. But that is where we're spending quite a lot of time on convincing also the European authorities, the European Commission. We're working also with the European Court of Auditors to work towards a system whereby they would accept the national practices. We had, I would say, this was under the 7th framework program. There was this possibility in theory to have national costing systems accepted through a certification methodology. And there were several either institutions or systems that worked towards that. Particularly in the UK, they used the UK full costing methodology. They developed a sort of European model. In the end, it was abandoned because the conditions that were attached to that European level made it so complex that institutions said, well, if we have to adapt our own methodologies so far, it doesn't make any sense. And that's a little bit the challenge. We're still arguing for it. We're trying to bring the actors together, that saying what makes sense is not pushing all European system into the one European way of doing this, but rather the openness to accept where there is a methodology. And then we have published a report where we show which systems these are, being Norway, the UK, Ireland, etc., where it would make sense to do that. But if you do it if you attach so many conditions that again the institutions need to adapt their methodology, then it doesn't make any sense. So I join Joan in your call. If from a system level, the national political authorities that have a say in the different constellations in Brussels. So at the moment, there are discussions by national experts. There are also national agencies involved in the implementation. There, if you have a strong voice and join already those who are there, then maybe we make some steps in the next funding program.
Aga nüüd oleks ilmselt õige hetk Elis ka vestlusesse tuua, sest me kindlasti kibeled juba nagu oma vaatepunkti sellele andma ja me kibeleme seda kuulata, et ole hea.
Esmalt aitäh nende väga huvitavate ettekannete eest.
First of all, I would like to thank you for the very interesting presentations. I'm representing Archimedes, the organization that acts as intermediary for the European funds, and our annual budget is more than 350 million. But it was really interesting to hear what you had to say, because what we did in the period 2014 to 20, as funders, we wanted to focus rather on achieving the goals of the universities. And together with the ministry, we have developed several of the measures where the universities themselves can pick what the goals and strategically important activities are for them. And we have tried to support the universities in achieving those goals. We have tried to find out what are the obstacles that do not allow them to achieve those goals. And it is evident there's certain red tape involved, both on documents level and control level, but the focus during this period has been more on the goals set by the universities within the framework of the projects and achieving them. And Ulle very nicely mentioned that the share of EU structural funds in funding the university's research activities. And then that is why I wanted to ask both Thomas and Joan. I will ask this in Estonian. You mentioned that it was important to find a balance between the basic funding and the competition-based funding. So where would this balance lie, in your opinion, and whether the competition-based instruments can help improve this balance and improve the competencies in certain fields, and how will this work?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very relevant question, which unfortunately hasn't got a very straightforward answer. As I already mentioned, you really need to look in your own system how it works. And there's also a question between the reality and the theory and the reality. But in general, I think the balance, I would, as I already indicated, a sort of almost half and half balance between direct funding and competitive funding towards universities, including the teaching mission. That would, for me, in a European comparison, too much on the competitive part. As I said, the competitive funding has several aims, of course. So it's aimed at improving competition. So you have competition, so that inspires excellence, inspires innovation. So you have all these advantages. But if the percentage part is too large, you require too much resources, and also of those actors who actually are meant to undertake research, that they spend too much part on the administration of these projects. And even if you outsource this, if you have the support staff within institutions who help very often, of course, in the application process, but then also throughout the whole funding cycle, you have too many resources in that part, which takes away time of the primary activities of doing teaching. So that's why I said I think it would be important that the percentages are different, that the block grant funding should be the main part of funding, and the other funding sources, competitive national level or competitive through European funds, should be rather complementary funding sources. And in an ideal way also that you have synergies, so that you say, okay, you can fund one activity with several different funding sources or different elements, and that is in reality a very complex issue to combine the national funds, the European funds that are channeled through, because you have to follow several rules that are not necessarily the same. If I take the depreciation rules, it's just one element, but you have a so that's in a system setup. That would be a very important part. Of course, it requires that the money is in the system, or that the willingness is to move funds to that part, that the leverage is the right percentage. Of course, I would argue, and as you've seen the comparison in the European level, to higher the percentages, it doesn't mean that you would reduce the funds of the competitive level, but rather increase at the national level, which you can see in a European comparison makes sense. So if you want to achieve the aims, and I think that's always a political question, then do we want to be competitive at a European international level? Well, then you need to invest.
Joan?
Hello. Yeah, I might just add from Ireland's perspective, I mean, as Thomas alluded to earlier, the funds directly from government to the block grant have reduced over the years, and it is causing a lot of worry in the system. But just might give you an example of us in SFI, how we fund we have 16 large-scale research centres that we started to fund back in 2012, and we have just renewed the six more research centres that had started in 2012 and got renewed for the second term funding. But as part of the funding, the model for the first phase was that we would fund the research and we would give 70% of the funding, but the universities would be required to get 30% in matched industry funding, both in cash and in kind. So that's a way, I guess, of the universities trying to leverage research funding from industry, both SMEs and multinationals. That has been very successful. It's brought a lot of cash, extra research cash into the universities. So for the second term funding in 2019, we've actually amended the percentages to a third for Science Foundation Ireland, a third for EU, Horizon 2020, so to get the funding in, and then a third from non-competitive, non-exchequer funding. So if that model were introduced in Estonia, it might be a way for the universities to leverage the funding from the funding bodies and leverage it then and get industry funding and more and more now philanthropic or non-competitive funding. Obviously, we'll see how that model goes because the 6 new centres have just started in July. They have complained saying it's very aggressive, but we shall see how that goes. But it's just another way of getting industry to invest. And what we have in Ireland is we have collaborative research agreements. So it isn't just contract research, it's actually collaborative, and then the university generally owns the IP. So it's just it's a way we've leveraged our funding, government funding, trying to get it from industry. Mm-hmm. And it has been very successful so far.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
May I just add to that, because I think that's a very good example. What I meant at the beginning, you need to look at your own system, how the fabric is designed. And particularly, Joan, as you said, in Ireland, the way you try to leverage funding from industry and business requires that you have a sector surrounding in the innovation ecosystems that business and industry is doing also a sufficient amount of research. If that is not the case in one system, then of course this kind of leverage funding goes into, well, the empty space, or then you don't have the same capacity. So that is something where you need to look at your system. Do you have an industry and business sector who does sufficient research within your system that you can leverage and put, let's say, incentive funding out there by saying we fund you several parts of that, you need to find the other part from research and industry. So very good example.
I just want to add that maybe one of the characteristic features in Estonia is that in many industry sectors, the enterprises are very small. They are even micro enterprises, which means that their capacity to invest into research is very, very small. This is why we have large numbers of very small projects, because the industry are not able to pay more. And also those small enterprises, they expect to have some support from the government to support the start of R&D and innovation in the enterprise. So that this is different from the Western European countries, and we have to address that in Estonia. Yeah.
Aitäh. Nüüd oleks hea hetk selleks, et kuulates on ka teil kindlasti tekkinud erinevaid küsimusi.
I'm sure that you have some questions as well. We do not only have to cover only this specific topic we have been discussing now, but maybe you have some other questions as well. So whatever came to your mind, because we have a microphone. So if you have a comment or a question, please.
I'm Andres Kopper from Estonian Research Council. I have actually one question to both of the speakers. First of all, to Thomas Estermann. Perhaps it's important for this audience to make a clarification. What's meant on European level under the block funding of the universities? Does it include both research and higher education stream? Because I'm asking because usually in this country, the two streams are usually separated. And the high proportion of the competitive funding is meant on the basis of calculations within the research funding stream. And then I have a question to Irish colleague. Have you been able to evaluate the cost of your auditing system in terms of percentage or something like this? How costly this is?
I will go first. Thank you for your question. Well, we have found that we've halved our costs of the systems audits, and it's a good point. I meant to allude to it. Instead of costing maybe in the past maybe €50,000 a year for our audits, we have the cost, so we get the same audit coverage at half the cost because we're sharing the cost with the Health Research Board. So it's a good point. It has been efficient for us also. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, for the clarification, when I'm talking in terms of block grant that will cover both also the funding for teaching as well as for research. That's the case in several European systems. I mean, the streams are very different, but the block grant means that actually the institution gets the money according to either indicators or whatever the formula is, but then once it arrives at an institution, they can allocate the money across the whole institution, be it for the teaching mission or for the research mission. In reality, this flexibility is not that high because, as I mentioned, you have a very high number of margin of fixed costs at the institution. So it's the infrastructure, there's the staff costs. So in reality, the room for maneuver is very often relatively limited. So this freedom is already pre-allocated at the institution. And if I might say also something on the costs, because we also asked from the institutional perspective, some institutions that have undergone the process of moving towards system and process audit. So the cost at the beginning is higher, so to establish that, you have the certain investment costs, but then the clear feedback was that the costs of the audits have decreased, so particularly staff costs that need to deal, because the number of audits have been reduced. Again, if I use the example of the FFG, the Austrian one, they have doing much less audits than in the past when they have moved towards the system and process audits, which in the case of Austria they haven't done with all institutions but only with several. So there you can see really the difference between those who have gone down that route and the ones that haven't.
Mm-hmm. Can I quickly interject? In your presentation you said that in addition to block grants, there's a growth of other financial instruments being used, and you underlined that as an area of tension. What did you mean specifically?
Well, if you look at competitive funding, the traditional way of allocating them is via a grant. That means the funder gives the money to the beneficiary, and the beneficiary uses it. What we also have now at European level very often is using other tools like debt financing, providing loans towards institutions. So they get basically cash to fund something, but they would need to have to pay this back. At European level, for example, the European Fund for Strategic Investment, which was established at the beginning of the Juncker Commission, they have taken money from Horizon Europe to move it in a sort of guarantee fund, whereby the idea was as well to leverage cash into the system, that you would fund research that in the end would bring in capital or cash. So that is, of course, problematic in several ways because several systems are not allowed, universities are not allowed to take loans themselves, so they would have to do it via other constructions. And it's something very different to fund basic research where this is not, I mean, you don't fund via, you don't get extra capital in to fund something that might lead to an innovation whenever, but where you don't have a product in place that sells. So, but this is a trend. Also, trying to get more cash into the research funding system, which is not there. But it's we would argue it's of limited use. It can be of use in order to bridge in shortness of cash and capital available, but in the long term, we believe that a grant funding system is an important part to allow the basic research, which is a very strong pillar of innovation, to flourish.
Thank you. That's what I was wondering about, especially in the light of Rector Aaviksoo's opening statement, where he said that in basic science you're not sure if you're getting a result at all when you're doing research. Alice said that's it.
I just maybe have a follow-up question to your remark and also to Joan, that you also said that a lot of personnel costs are financed from your grants, and it is a problem for. You never know on a competitive grant base if you get the grant next time or not. Or do you have kind of exit strategies for projects you finance, or how do you deal with this risk that by the end of the project there will be some kind of salaries, or the project will continue, or the team will continue? And also maybe another question, you said that you funded about 70% of your centers. Now you dropped it down to 30 comes from Horizon. At the moment we fund about 95% of the costs, so the universities usually add 5%. So in the new programming period we see that it might shift, that the universities would have to fund more. When you made those changes, what risks did you foresee, and did those risks you foresaw then also realized, and what's your strategy in dealing with those?
Thank you for that question. Just to clarify, in relation to our individual awards, and traditionally, we only make a contribution towards the research. So the researchers are employed by the university, so there's no risk with the funding agency. It's important, unlike maybe in Estonia, say if we award typically an individual principal investigator award of approximately €1 million. So the lead investigator would typically be employed full-time by the university. So we don't cover his or her costs. So then they would contract or offer a 4-year contract to PhD students or to MSc students, fellows, etc. But that is the responsibility of the university. And they have to manage that. So a lot of the times the contract would be issued for the period of our award, which might be 5 years. So we don't have a risk of an exit strategy, etc. Under employment law in Ireland, the universities have to be careful that if you give 2 or more contracts, you're into effectively a permanent situation. But that's for the university to manage, and not for Science Foundation Ireland. In relation to the 70% and the 30% funding, the reduction to 30, it's actually it's only started since July of 2019, and it is phased in. The percentages are reducing over the next number of years. So again, it's probably too early to see what the impact is. But the whole idea is for the research centres to become more self-sustainable and not too dependent on government funding, and that's why we're phasing it out. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, I think this is one of the key questions of what I would say the competitiveness and the sustainability of a system. And simplified speaking, you would have in most of the Western European systems, the idea is that research staff is primarily paid through the institutional block grant or the institutional direct stream funding. and everything else through competitive funding would be extra. Now, in reality, also in many Eastern European systems, you have a more and more higher number of research staff based on the assumption that you always get a certain amount of funding from competitive funds. The problem there is, and that again it depends from system to system, how you can hire those staff and what their contracts are. Because very often they are on a renewable basis, and in some systems this is a legal problem. I mean, my own home country, Austria, they have a massive problem recently because there was a high court decision that actually it's illegal to renew these contracts on more than three times or more than 2 times, which pose a lot of problems for Austrian universities, because suddenly a practice that has been established to use part of the research staff funded through these competitive funds, and now they basically have to change the system. So there is a strong link to the legal system, which again is a question of the sustainability in the end, to say the basis of the research that you're undertaking at an institution needs to come from a sustainable funding, and that is not the competitive funding. In particularly if it's also based on, I would say, the European funding, because there you have another insecurity that you don't know. Are you going to be part of that funding? How much does it look like? I mean, I'm not going to need to refer to the insecurity in the next MFF discussions. So in the long term, if you want to keep up the competitiveness, it is essential to move to a sustainable funding stream of the core of research undertaking at universities. And of course the competitive funding is an important element, but in the long run it can't be the one that sort of actually taking the role of funding what should be funded through a sustainable stream.
Kas meil on ruumis veel küsimusi meie esinejatele, mis on vahepeal tekkinud?
May I ask one more question to Joan about your joint audit approach? You mentioned that this is a good way also to learn from the audits. And can you just mention what are the main weaknesses at the universities about the financial control or reporting about the project? What is something that should be learned by us, for example, here?
Okay, thank you. I think it's important to state over the last number of years we have got very good assurance from our auditors for the accounting practices at the university. So that provides our audit committee very good assurance. I suppose maybe the paperwork and the procedures over when awards are granted and making sure the costs are only charged during the period of the award, and that if the award is transferred, that there's proper documentation. So I think if any maybe low findings would be maybe where the procedures over the controls over the grant as it goes through the stages of being awarded, and then if it's transferred and if it's closed, or if there's staff moving in and out of the award. I think just procedures and documentation for audit purposes. But I think very good assurance overall that the public funds are being dispensed. Of course, it's important to note, in addition to the financial audits, we have a rigorous scientific reporting. They provide an annual report every year on their activities, and then we have a site visit on all our major awards where external reviewers come to the university, and then the researchers get to present, so on the scientific side. So that's totally separate from the financial audit, but that's very important because that shows, what is our money, what is the outputs of our money. But I think the procedures would be the main areas for small improvement in our universities.
May I?
In general terms, you can confirm that you can trust the universities, so that mainly the in general, you can trust the universities so that the processes are in place. Yeah.
We have a very high level of trust.
Actually, I was listening to your presentation. I was curious about that too. That were there any challenges in establishing that trust when you started the cooperation between the Health Research Board and yourself and the universities, or have there ever been sort of issues where the trust has fallen down? I understood from your presentation that you're working quite a bit on sort of the human level as well. You're bringing people together for them to network and create trust between them.
Yeah.
But have there been challenges in?
Not really since I joined. I've been there for 9 years. Before we had the joint audit approach, Science Foundation Ireland sent our own auditors in to do audit work, so it wasn't a completely new process. But I think in terms of trust, it's very important that we get a lot out of building the relationships with our research accountants. And as I said before, in a way, there are eyes and ears on the ground to make sure that only eligible costs are being charged to the award. Like, for example, last year, there was a researcher who was leaving the country, and then while he was still away, the award was still going on, and he was charging pieces of equipment, and he wanted to charge pieces of equipment, etc., to the award. So the accountant got on to me and said, this doesn't look right, so it was disallowed. I think you mentioned one thing that Science Foundation we do find is that sometimes the universities don't tell us if one of their researchers has either gone on a sabbatical or has left the award. So sometimes there is a delay in telling us, because we can't, if a researcher leaves Ireland, the award stops. The award doesn't travel overseas. And sometimes they can arrange for another investigation to take over the running of the award, but only at our discretion. So sometimes that can happen. And what? He's not here. He's gone abroad, and they don't always tell us. But so a high degree of trust. Yeah.
Thomas, you were also.
Yeah, I think I wanted to add 2 points to that, and because the trust doesn't build overnight. So you have several elements, and I think this was very clearly the case in Ireland, where also first the universities build together among themselves the sort of more coherent system, so that you know what you expect. What you see at Trinity will not be fundamentally different what you see at UCD or another institution, and that helps already as a first step. So hence the recommendation, building a system together that helps. We've seen, now you take the Norwegian Research Council, they have strongly cooperated also with the National University Association and working groups of the institutions to develop this together. And that builds also relationships between the people, so it's not someone has designed something that someone else has to sign up to. People have been involved, they know each other, they know that there is a good working relationship, and that changes fundamentally where you can see here, well, yeah, we trust our institutions. If you have that process in place, I'm pretty sure you will also have then the case by saying, yes, we trust our institutions. And the second point, if I may, that I wanted to say is, what you also mentioned, Joan, it's not only about the financial reporting. What is increasingly more and more important that you communicate not only to the funder but also to society is, what is it that you have been doing with that? So what is it good for the community out there? And that is sometimes challenging because, of course, the whole institutional reward system is geared towards publications in scientific journals, which does not necessarily have a language to speak to the citizens. So you have, again, here, this reporting is increasingly becoming important. How do you transmit that the great things that are taking place in universities are understood by the communities? If we don't manage to change this or do this, then there will be no support for what I think there's a common agreement, the importance of research and innovation towards society, then we will not have that support, the backing up. And then the question about the relationship between competitive funding and block grant funding doesn't pose itself in that system. If we can manage this understanding, then there might be more support for channeling money into that.
Alice.
Yeah, I wanted to have a follow-up question on what you marked that we also do in our Center of Excellence program. We use external evaluators to evaluate the scientific work the projects do. So I kind of ask an intriguing question. Would you consider leaving out any financial reporting at all and rely on the funding based only on the feedback from the evaluators or the so-called scientific reports?
The answer is no.
Why?
Why? We wouldn't, the fact that the research is done we would still have to find out how our funds were dispersed to make sure that the staff were charged correctly and only correct costs were charged to the award. So we wouldn't be able to rely just on the scientific side. We wouldn't have assurances that the money was spent correctly. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Nüüd on võimalus veel viimane kord ruumist küsida. Siin ees on üks küsimus. Kas me mikrofoni saame kusagilt? Tuleb? Siit poolt.
Well, my question is a bit more general. I learned that the Science Foundation Ireland is reporting to the Ministry of Business and Trade. So that's quite interesting, and that perhaps well, for most of Estonian policymakers, it's kind of weird to think that it can be arranged in this way. But what was the political debate before? It was the Science Foundation Ireland was established in 2003. Perhaps you can tell a little bit about how this decision was made and how, or more specifically, how is it coordinated today with the other ministries? Does it work fine?
Okay. Back before 2003, there was an agency always within business. It was called Forfos. So it was a department within the Department of Business, and that ran the scientific research. And then it was only set up as its own agency in 2003, and it was modelled on the National Science Foundation in the United States. And our first Director General came from Bill Harris. Don't know if anyone knows him. Came from the United States, so it always had that sort of slant. I guess it always was in our Department of Business, and again, you know, Ireland's a small economy. Jobs are so important, and I think that was the focus, that had to make impact and make impact on the job. So I don't really know. I mean, I wasn't around when it was formed, but I'm glad it's not within the Department of Education because I think it could be. It has more just scope. Now, on our board, on the Science Foundation Ireland board, there is a representative from our Department of Business, and there's also a representative from the Department of Education on our board. But it works well. You said, you know, you asked just. It does work well, and unfortunately, we haven't got as many increases. We put in for, you know, increases in funding every year to fund different research projects, and very good claims, but unfortunately, because of recessionary issues and Brexit, etc., we just haven't got the funding, and it's unfortunate, but we just haven't taken. There's other more important areas that have taken precedence. So I hope I've answered your question.
Absolutely, thank you.
On meil veel mõni küsimus ruumis? Ei paista praegu. Okay. Then maybe to sort of start to wrap up this discussion, if we take a hypothetical European country where these what is your name for it? Holistic funding reforms have not taken place, and a lot of the funders are doing things separately, and so are the higher education or research organizations, universities. Who should take initiative? How does the impetus for making those reforms start, or how should it start? If I understood correctly from Thomas, you're indicating that it needs to come from the university's side, from their leadership and rectors' councils taking initiative, streamlining their processes, and then approaching funders. Did I understand correctly? Is this what you're recommending, or are there other ways that you've seen happen in countries?
Well, I think in practice, it's never that black and white. So very often you have a reason why you have a discussion in your system, and I haven't seen any system where it's just, let's say, the university sector, nor top down by the public sector. Well, that might happen from time to time, but very often there is a reason why you have a discussion, and then it's really about how can you structure it, and then that's why it's so important. It might be a reason why you start discussing some parts of your funding system. So, like, okay, do we have the right funding system for research and innovation? But as we're talking about universities who have a very broad mission of learning and teaching, research and innovation, outreach and others, it's always a good occasion, whatever comes up, to think first on the big picture and asking yourself, what do we actually want to achieve? That is rarely the case in discussions. I mean, it's so obvious that you start yourself, what do we want in our system? And that needs to come very clearly from policymakers. What do we need? What kind of learning environment do we need? What kind of research and innovation fabric do we need? What is the status quo? That's the other thing. So the question, do we have enough business environment that is undertaking research so that we can then design certain instruments that make use of that. But saying establishing something like Science Foundation Ireland has wouldn't work in Estonia if you don't have that sort of business fabric. So there are always certain logic steps that should taking place when having the opportunity of discussing funding. So that would be my recommendation, which is, I would say, the rare case. Very often you go into, okay, here we have a problem, we talk about details of that problem without taking a step back. So for me, the recommendation, take opportunities of making a holistic reform, because I hope what you could see is it's very much connected. Audit procedures are very much connected how you have the whole funding system taking place. So it needs all of them. And if there's one community that's taking the lead, and be it the institutional ones, then yeah, it's about making sure that you address all the right points and have a long-term vision rather than fixing one issue, and have a long-term strategy in place where you want to go with your funding reform to have the best and most efficient system for your country, for Estonia.
Thank you. And Joan, what would your recommendation for such a hypothetical country be? Where should the impetus come from, or how should the building of a system similar to Ireland's start?
Well, I suppose I can't really speak from the government, or obviously we'd like the government to invest more, but from funding agency, I think it's collaboration more with the other funding agencies, and even international collaborations, which Science Foundation Ireland has invested in over the number of years. I meant to say, like, for the research centres, we require that a number of different research centres in Ireland all collaborate. So it's to get people working together and to have centres of excellence. So that's really important. Then the researchers work together, the admin staff work together, so much better finance staff, much better collaboration. And we also have collaborations with we have a US Ireland fund. We have collaborations that we're building up with North-South collaborations, and we're hoping to get funding for, if Brexit happens, for North-South research centres. So I think from the funding side, just greater collaboration with other funding agencies to leverage leverage the resources. That's what I would say that funding agency should try for.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming, for having the presentations, for having this discussion with us. Aitäh ka Üllele ja Alice'ile, et te tulite selles
Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Ülle, for sharing this discussion with us. Thank you.